And good afternoon, evening, whatever it happens to be in your world, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston, and over there is my great friend William Bell. And we've been discussing the Messianic Temple and Ezekiel chapter 37. But last Friday night, William had a formal 2 hours debate. I guess, it's actually, I guess a little bit
four
over.
hours and
Yeah,
15
4
minutes.
hours, 4 hour debate with a gentleman by the name of Scott Clem. Now, Scott Clem is an amillennialist, although I must say that he is of a stripe of amillennialism that is a little bit foreign to my upbringing in the amillennial world. He had some nuances there that as I sit and listened and watched the debate, I was like, whoa, where did that come from? And I have to be candid here, and I don't want to be disrespectful whatsoever to to Scott, but I felt like he was, well, we've got an old saying in Oklahoma, Arkansas, what have you, of just throwing a lot of stuff up against the wall, hoping to find something that'll stick. I felt like he was just looking for anything that maybe you could not answer. And so he was having a great deal of difficulty, number one, explaining very, very clearly what his position was. And then certainly he had a tremendous amount of problem in answering the arguments that you made. So, William, why don't you give us your impression as the participant uh, of the debate?
Well, that was an interesting debate. Let me put a little context to it to begin with. Um, at the time, I didn't really know how I was going to approach it, at least up to an hour before the debate. I had been studying since November, preparing for it, had lots of material available, was trying to get it all organized, and somehow it just didn't come together. And but I had this chart that I had made, which I presented in the debate. And so an hour before the debate, I started looking at the chart and I said, well, this looks like a pretty good affirmative just on this chart alone. So I pulled the two charts together and I said, well, this is what I'm going to use. And so that became the affirmative. I was extremely tired, hadn't had any rest. And, if you listen to me trying to just introduce myself, I couldn't even get the words out to figure out who I was at the time. And I was so concerned that I was going to become so drained in energy that I wouldn't be coherent and wouldn't be able to speak. Fortunately, as happens a lot of times, when I'm either sick or when I'm not feeling my best, when I don't think I have the best of a message or whatever, somehow the energy comes. And by the time I'm done speaking, I feel better than I did when I went in. And I'm sure, you kind of can deal with that. On the other hand, of course, I heard that, Scott was taking Red Bull and had a crash probably by the end of the end of the discussion. Someone told me that, but I didn't know at any rate. But I just don't take that kind of stuff because I really don't think it's good for the body. But as far as the discussion was concerned, here's another point, and this happened to me in one other debate, as you know. We had exchanged questions. We'd agreed to exchange questions. Well, I turned in questions probably 2 weeks
at least
before the debate. And I kept waiting and waiting. And he had sent a message saying that I would have them at least 5 days before the debate.
Yeah,
well, I didn't get them. I called on Monday and asked for them. I think I got them maybe 3 days before the debate. And the answers were extremely long. He's posted them on the site now. They were extremely long. And so it took a while to try to weed through all of the, wording, because he's very wordy on some of those things, to just figure out what he was saying. And so that was an issue too. And I was thinking that I'd probably use some of that material, but it didn't really come up. But as far as the discussion was concerned, after we did get started, he went through his presentation, I went through my opening speech. And then when we got to the rebuttals, that's really where the discussion started. And so from there, he began with his arguments. I didn't see anything that he was saying to me that was really complicated or that, I couldn't respond to. And so I did. respond to them. And in a debate, they're it's like a fight, really. And I think of it like a fight. And I don't care, even if you have your best fighter out there in the game, every now and then he's going to get hit with a punch,
Yep.
It may not take him out, but he'll know that he's in a fight from that point of view. So I recognize that as far as it goes, and but still I can't think of anything that I thought was very significant. Some of the telling points in the discussion was, of course, the time statements in 1 Corinthians 15 and also 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which I knew he had admitted in the debate with Stacy Tuberville.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he gives in one hand and he takes away in the other. So he'll say, yes, this is the Corinthians, and then he'll come back and he'll interject himself into the text because he knows that he can't maintain a consistent view of the time statements and hold to his futurist view because that negates it. And yet he will argue from being, or at least the claim of being a partial preterist, that, you have to insist on these statements because he does take a partial preterist view on Matthew 24 and on some other texts. And, you were commenting about his being an amillennialist. By the time that debate was over, I thought maybe he was an amillennialist, a partial preterist, and a premillennialist or dispensationalist, especially when he was talking about coming back to this renovated earth and all of that. And I'm saying, wow, this is really, really something. Let's see, another point. Let's see, where am I? I'm trying to think. Oh, he admitted that Romans 8, and this was from his questions, that Romans 8 and the questions that I sent him, because I asked him directly whether the body of Romans 8 and Romans, let's see, that's verse 10 and 11, and also in verse 21 or 22 and verse 23. So, and then there you had the mortal body, the body of corruption, and then you had the redemption of the body. And I asked him, were those the same, did that refer to the same body situation that you had in 1 Corinthians 15? And he said, yes, and also threw 2 Corinthians 5 in there. Mm-hmm. Well, I said, well, that's really devastating for him if he takes that view. And when I pointed out to him that the body was dead because Christ entered it, he came up with some explanation as if to say the body died because of Moses.
Yeah, but I was stunned. Literally, I was stunned. That's one of the points in the debate. I'm going, what in the world is this guy saying?
Yeah.
And the only thing that I would have to say about that, and of course this may get back to your fatigue, and believe you me, I could tell you were fatigued. I've known you long enough to know when you're just worn smooth out down to a nub. But that was a point at which I felt like you should have just jumped on him, all over the top of him, jumped up and down and said, no, it says, only if Christ is in you, the body is dead. Not because of sin, but because of Christ.
You're actually right. And I did that in the, I think in my response to him, I pointed that out, but that was one that I was intending to really work on. And I just didn't, for whatever reason. I guess I had a little lapse of energy there or something, but that was supposed to have been a major point in the debate. Pointing out that it says, if Christ is in you. And not only that, I mean, he's got a situation where he's got death from Moses and death from Christ. Mm-hmm. What I termed for him was this split Adam concept.
Yeah.
So he's got two deaths and two lives going on in the text. And if the body was dead, then, and that's the physical body, then where's the correlation of that to anything that happened, since he's arguing that it was the spiritual first and then the natural? I thought when I suggested to him, when I told him that if this is the already but not yet, and by the way, I coined a new phrase.
Yeah. That was really good.
I called it the already but never yet.
Yep.
Because he, and I thought about that phrase after the debate. I wish I had thought about it in the debate. But his concept of an already but not yet is not an already but not yet. He's got the spiritual beginning, and then from there, he's got the physical. But if it's a true already but not yet, he has to have the physical beginning as an already, and then the not yet of that same physical going on.
Yep.
And that just doesn't happen.
You
So
made the
that's,
point. You made the point. Why don't we, if it's an already but not yet, why don't we have arms sticking out of the ground and the legs sticking out of the ground, etc.?
yeah, yeah, exactly. So that really destroys that idea of an already but not yet. And then, of course, as I said, the order of the resurrection, first the natural, then the spiritual, and his position that it's the spiritual and then the natural was a just direct contradiction from
Yeah,
what the
let
scripture
me
says.
interrupt you here. When you press
Mhm.
that point to him and on him,
Mhm.
body language said to me that he knew he was trapped.
Yeah,
And he came back and said, yes, it is the spiritual first. And you're going, wait a minute. And of course, your response to that was, well, unfortunately for that position, that is not what Paul said. And you just came right back to the text, and he didn't know what to do with that. He
yeah,
was caught directly contradicting the order that Paul gave.
right.
That
That's
which
what
is
I told him. He was
spiritual is,
180 degrees away.
oh yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
he was 180 out on that. So there were lots and lots of telling points on that. One of the things that I probably would have jumped on it, but it was so early. And obviously, as you and I know, I'm a debater. I see things, you see things. Sometimes we say, well, I'll focus on this. And then you would say, no, I'll focus on that. That's just part of debate. But one of the things that he said right right off in his affirmative was early Christianity said that Israel's hope was being fulfilled, but not as anticipated. But then he went
I
in,
heard that.
yeah.
I heard that. But go ahead.
But then he affirmed that Israel's hope was physical resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I mean, that just, boy, that jumped out to me, and I'm going, go, William, get him on this. But
When you're listening to
oh
that,
yeah,
and then I I have a pen and I'm trying to write a point or two here and there, and then by the time he's done and it's read, it's time for you to come back and address those things. You're looking at your list and saying, okay, now what am I going to touch here? What am I going to
yeah, yeah.
touch here? And somehow it gets lost in that. And
You're
I know
never,
that
you're never, ever, ever able to cover everything. Just can't do
yeah,
it.
yeah. I tell you, the one that really was hilarious to me was his treatment of Matthew chapter 8.
Oh,
Now that was really something.
yes, it was. And you and I have talked before. We talked about this last week. I mean, Matthew chapter 8 is just unbelievably important. So go ahead and develop that.
Well, he argued that yes, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were raised starting on the day of Pentecost. But now wait a minute. This is supposed to be physical resurrection. And if it's physical resurrection, where are they? Now, that's when he ought to had some proof as to how you can determine whether or not they were raised. But he said, okay, that started on Pentecost. And then when I pressed him, I took him to Luke because I figured he might try to wiggle out of that statement. And I kept asking him, well, when, were the Jews going to be cast out? Who are the people cast out, et cetera? And he didn't want to answer that. So I, had him go over to Luke and look at it, and there's
You
no
made
way
him
he
read
can
it.
deny. Yes,
You made him read it.
I don't even think he wanted to read it.
No, I don't think he did.
He was trying not to, but once he read that, he had to admit that number one, it referred to the Jews. Number two, it happened in AD 70, and thus a resurrection occurred in AD 70. That was, and I should have exploited that even more than what I did. But there you have it. I mean, he's right there on record saying that a resurrection occurred in 70 AD and that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had, were raised from the dead in the first century.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
you know how much I love Matthew chapter 8. You and I both
yes.
do. And it's such a devastating argument that I knew when you went there, I knew he was going to have something really, really creative.
Yeah.
And basically he did. He got very, very creative. Oh yeah, yeah. There was a resurrection started on Pentecost.
Hmm.
Well, the only thing that I would have wanted to add is that the banquet, but you, I mean, you pointed it out sufficiently, and that
Hmm.
is that this is resurrection. This is the messianic banquet of Isaiah 25, but it's Isaiah 25 is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. This is not
Yes.
separate. This is not some kind of spiritual resurrection first and then waiting on physical, because Paul says that the resurrection of Isaiah chapter 25 verse 8, which is the time of the messianic banquet of Matthew chapter 8, that's it. So if you're going to admit, as he did, that Isaiah 25:6 began to be fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, then you're admitting that the resurrection of Isaiah 25:8 began to be fulfilled on Pentecost.
Yes.
Whoops.
Yep. Yep. I think another thing that he was trying hard to, and partially succeeded in doing, was to make sure I didn't go to Revelation 19 and 20, because I had asked him questions about that. And by the way, with his answers to the question on Matthew 8, let me see if I can find his statement just to show you how brief he was on that particular point when I asked him about it. I asked him if he could identify the time and the people who were cast out into outer darkness when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the prophets sat down in the kingdom. And he says the audience Christ is talking to and referring to is Christ rejecting Israel. I think this started to become evident at Pentecost when men were actually born again into God's kingdom. And that's all that he said about it. So I thought he was very, very short on that. And I think that question was one that he really didn't want to deal with. But back to what I was saying, my intentions were to go to Revelation 19 and Revelation 20 because I wanted to tie in, the millennium concept with the wedding and the marriage and the great white throne judgment and all of that, because that would have pulled the whole thing in one little, pocket, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Because, he's talking about a future judgment. You'd have the millennium involved, you'd have the wedding involved, you'd have resurrection involved, all of that right there at the great white throne judgment, ending when Jerusalem was destroyed, and when God took vengeance on Jerusalem. But he didn't really bite on that necessarily in his evasion of it. So that was that was another point that I was hoping that he would go down that road. But I think either from something that we said in the questions or whatever, he just felt like he didn't want to deal with that, because he really evaded that issue on the questions when I asked him that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. On let me see here. In my notes, I had written down that he was talking about Romans chapter 6, and he says, for a person to receive final resurrection is to enter into Christ's death, Romans chapter 6. And I was going, okay, develop that. Go ahead and try to work that out in your scheme. But then he said that was being worked out from between 30 and 70 when people joined in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, then doesn't that point us to 70 AD as the time of the likeness of his resurrection?
Exactly.
If not, why not?
Right. That was another issue. I actually had a chart on that from the debate with Sam that I wanted to get in there. Another distraction I had during the discussion was because I hadn't used that platform that much. And when they asked me to put my chart, so that everybody could see it, I was looking for buttons and stuff on my computer. I didn't know when my chart would be showing and when it was not, so I was almost afraid to touch it because I didn't want to expose something before it was time to present it and give him an edge on the argument. So I was kind of battling with technical issues along the way of the discussion. But Romans, and even that comes up in the debate that Chris Date had with Michael Miano. He defines resurrection and then lists Romans chapter 6 right there in the context. And
Yes.
I'm saying, this is crazy. But yeah, that would have been a good text to develop because I would have tied that directly into 1 Corinthians 15 as well. The
Well,
other
it's
point, and I
amazing.
don't, yeah,
It's just a point here, and let me get your thoughts on this. I mean, Chris Date says, and Scott Clem was saying here, the likeness of his resurrection has to be the physical likeness of Jesus's physical resurrection. Well, let's maybe look at that just a tad. Paul says, if, and it's the conditional first class, as I understand the Greek there, which means if it's the case, and it certainly is the case, if we have been buried with him in the likeness of Christ's death. So look what Scott and Chris Date both do. They say the likeness of Christ's death is physical death and physical resurrection. Well, what is being buried with him in the likeness of his death? Wouldn't that demand that we have to be physically crucified, physically buried in the dirt? I mean, if you're gonna say likeness of his death or resurrection means physical resurrection, then likeness of his death certainly has to mean physical death.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think he had a clue of what sowing was all about because I made that point about, if you're going to sow them, you don't sow dead grain. And
He
I don't know
didn't
what his
understand your
response on that.
question.
Yeah.
He flat did not understand the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said so. I don't understand what you're getting at. Yeah. Well, let's face it, most commentators do not understand Paul's point when he says that which you reap is not that which you sow, and it must fall into the ground and die to produce fruit.
Right.
That's so contrary to the traditional paradigm.
And the real issue there is that it's the ones who are already physical dead that he was discussing to be sown. So they didn't have a body to put in the ground.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do they die?
Yeah.
And in what body do they come, since they're no longer in a physical body? And it's like when the issue was raised up, when he said something about David had not ascended into the heavens. Well, David wasn't in that tomb either. His bones were.
Oh, well, okay.
You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, then, of course, he brings up, as everyone does, Chris Date brings it up in his videos, 2 Timothy chapter 2.
Yeah.
18. Now, he said something. Let me see if I can find it. He said, Hymenaeus said the resurrection was past. So for Paul, for Paul, all believers had already taken part in a corporate sense. He used the word corporate in the first resurrection. And I was kind of searching for his point there. I mean, I know he was trying to make the point again that the first resurrection is spiritual. So once he's back to the same problem that he had. But I thought it fascinating that he said that all believers were part of the corporate resurrection that was taking place. Well, if that's true, and I think his point was, since the corporate spiritual resurrection was already past, that demanded that Hymenaeus was saying the physical resurrection was already past. Is that not what he was saying?
Yes.
Okay. As I was listening to him, I found him a little bit difficult to follow, and so I just wanted to make sure.
And I pointed out to him. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I pointed out to him that his view of the spiritual being first and basically completed at the cross, because that was his idea, that what he was teaching was the doctrine of Hymenaeus and Philetus.
That's exactly right.
And a lot of these guys don't get that when they pull up that scripture and they argue for it and say that the spiritual had already taken place. Then they're saying the physical hadn't taken place, because if they claim that he's taught that, they've got to have some proof. They've got to have some evidence of it, and there's none. And so from that perspective, he's teaching the doctrine of Hymenaeus and Philetus. And I don't think he had a comment at all when I went to 2 Timothy 2:11 and 12 and pointed out that they had already died and that the life had to be antithetical to the death. And
Exactly.
again, in 2 Timothy 4:1, that Paul's teaching was the resurrection was about to occur. You know, the judgment, the resurrection was about to occur. He didn't. Because one, there's the time statement in 2 Timothy 4:1 that he didn't want to deal with.
Right. One of the things that he said, and let's see if you understood it the way I heard it. He said that Hymenaeus, all that he was really doing was arguing about the definition of resurrection. That's how I wrote it down.
I don't quite recall that particular point.
Okay, well, that's
and I
how
haven't
I
gone back and listened to the debate yet either.
Yeah, that's how I wrote it down. And I had great big question marks out beside it. When I wrote it down, I'm going, where does he get the idea that Hymenaeus was arguing about the definition? I mean, after all, Scott has already argued that the spiritual resurrection has taken place.
Yes.
So Hymenaeus wouldn't be arguing about that. That means that the only resurrection left for Hymenaeus to be affirming, and in Scott's view, must be physical. So why is he saying that Hymenaeus was arguing about the definition of resurrection? So maybe I misheard that. If you go back and listen to that, you can correct me on that. But I just
well, I just didn't pick it up that that's one of the things that he was saying about it. So it's he probably did if you wrote it down.
Okay. Then he asked a question. Oh yeah. He said, how did the first Christians define resurrection? And he said they defined it bodily, not in a Platonic or Gnostic sense. Number two, not like the Greeks who viewed the body as a prison, but they viewed it as earth renewed. So that's what he brought up, that Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, some were denying the resurrection, period. So what were they denying? They were not denying the Platonic sense. They were not denying the Greeks. And so that what that means is they must have been denying the renewal of the earth.
Weird.
Maybe that's another one of those that as I was listening, I was hearing something that he wasn't actually saying.
Yeah.
Now,
well, I know at least twice he talked about the renewal of the earth, and one of them was on Acts 3, and I think the other one was on Romans 8.
Yes.
So that's why I remember him saying something about the renewal of the earth.
Yeah, you're right. Those are the two. Those are the two that he appealed to. And William, you appealed a couple of different times because, as I understood him to say, the Old Testament saints were in heaven because of Pentecost and onward, right?
Right.
Okay. But you kept
that was his point.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But you kept bringing him back to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 39. And I saw him go here and there and all over the map and never address Hebrews 11:39. So why don't you expound on that just a little bit to clarify in the mind of the viewers, the folks that will be watching tonight, the power of Hebrews 11:39.
Oh yeah, he went and talked about this cloud of witnesses, and I have to be careful because some of the answers that I might be responding might have come from the paper and not necessarily from the debate because all of that was kind of jammed together. But the idea is he's claiming that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had already received resurrection and they were in heaven because he was arguing that for the dead in 1 Thessalonians 4. But the text says in Hebrews 11 that they had all died in faith, not having received the promise. And as late as the writing of Hebrews, the text speaks of Abraham saying, but now he desires a heavenly city or a new land. And I didn't get back to it, and I wanted to go to Hebrews because he brought up at least twice they were already in the New Jerusalem. in Hebrews chapter 12. Remember, they had come
Yes.
to Mount Zion,
Oh,
but but in Hebrews 13 and 14, I think it is,
yes.
they were looking for the city which was about to come. And so that was one of the points. But the whole idea was the text says these all died in faith, not having received the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they, apart from us, should not be made perfect. And of course, being made perfect there is just basically synonymous with the resurrection being consummated. And so his view on that was totally contrary, and that contradicted the things that he was saying on the day of Pentecost. And if it was physical resurrection in Hebrews chapter 11, then that really strikes a blow against his concept of Matthew 8, 11, and 12, and resurrection being full on the day of Pentecost.
I'll see, I had something that came across just now that I had just remembered from the debate. Oh my goodness, what in the world was that? Oh yeah, he tried to tie it in with 1 Thessalonians chapter 4:13 and following, where he said that Christ would come with, not for, the saints. So he was trying to bring that in to try to prove that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were already in heaven. And of course, what
Right.
I thought of, I did, yeah, I've got it in my notes right here that I wrote it down. Well, according to the writer of Hebrews, Christ has entered into that which is within the veil. He is the forerunner of our faith, which is the Greek word forerunner is prodromos, which means the first to go in. He's the pioneer. So no one had gone into heaven before Jesus. Yet here is Scott Clem saying, oh yeah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were all in heaven before Jesus ever died, which means, of course, this didn't come up in the debate, but it naturally means if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were in heaven before Christ came, they got to go to heaven before Christ ever died, before he ever made the atonement, before forgiveness was ever given. I don't know how in the world a person could ever make that kind of an argument. But he did.
I agree. He did. He did.
He did.
You know, one question I asked him, Don, and this one really got me. It didn't come up in the debate per se, but it's in the Q&A, which is now published on the channel with the debates. But under question number 6, I asked him to circle, check, or underline all the texts that are related to or based on Daniel 12, 1 through 3.
Oh, boy.
And I asked them to leave out those which are not, or the ones that are not related to Daniel 12, to leave them unmarked. Let's see. I can't count all the verses I have on here, but let me just give some examples. John 5, 28 and 29, the resurrection text in John 6, 11, 24, Acts 17, 30, Acts 24, 15, 25, 26, 6 through 8, Romans 8, 23, 13, 11, all the passages that we would understand to be resurrection passages, 1 Corinthians 15, etc. Do you know, out of all of the texts that were resurrection passages that are supposed to be related to Daniel, and all of them are, he chose 2 passages. One was Romans 13, 11, and 12, and the other, which is basically a direct quote from Daniel.
Yeah.
And Ephesians 5. And I
Ephesians
knew why
5,
he chose
14, awake thou
14.
from the dead, thou dead.
Yes, exactly. That's Daniel 2 and Psalm 17, 15 as well.
Yeah.
But he chose those because he felt he could get away in saying, well, that's just a spiritual, moral exhortation or something, and not referring to the resurrection. But all these other passages he left out, and basically saying they're in no way connected to Daniel 12. Well, that tells me a lot about what he thinks about Daniel 12 too.
Yeah.
That's saying that he doesn't believe that that's a resurrection passage.
That would certainly indicate it. I mean, how do you leave out 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection to eternal life, from a relationship to Daniel chapter 12, resurrection to eternal life? I mean, how do you divide that? How do you create a division there?
Yeah, that's kind of like David Hester did in your debate. Did he act as though he couldn't find very much related to Daniel 12?
Yep. And he
Yeah.
changed his position on Daniel 12 three times during the debate.
Mm.
Yeah, three times during the debate, just like he did on Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27.
Mm.
He changed his position during the actual debate three separate times. And when I pointed it out, he just basically shrugged his shoulders and said, so what? You know?
Yeah. Another point about Scott's view was his admission that Matthew 3 is the fall of Jerusalem. That harvest
Yeah.
imagery in Matthew 3 is the fall of Jerusalem. And it's the harvest symbol going back to, Malachi. And yet at the same time, he looks at Matthew 13, the end of the age is the harvest. And he places at a whole different time frame.
I remember reading that in his answers to your questions, and that just, I mean, that's really kind of mind-boggling when somebody can say, okay, you got harvest imagery that was clearly imminent in Matthew chapter 3, and you got harvest imagery which is explicit in Matthew 13, and I thought it was interesting when you asked him, is Matthew 13:43 drawing directly on Daniel chapter 12, and he refused to answer.
Yeah.
Just refused to answer. He just blew right by it, changed the subject. And I go, oh, okay. So he really does see a problem with Daniel chapter 12. Instead of coming out and saying, I really don't think that Daniel 12 is a promise of the resurrection. Okay, then you could talk about that. But instead of coming out and saying that, he just simply deflected attention away from the connection between Daniel 12 and Matthew 13:43. So I thought that was extremely, extremely evasive. Okay, let me see here. He said on 1 Corinthians 15, back to the point that we were talking about a few moments ago, we shall not all sleep. He admitted that was the Corinthians. I don't know how you can make that argument, make that admission without giving up, as I like to say, the farm, the dog, the cat, the goldfish, the gerbil. You're giving up the whole farm right there.
Yeah.
So he had to extrapolate from that. Well, not all Christians will die. Okay, so let me see. Then he said something that's really kind of fascinating to me. I want to see if you caught it, see if you want to expound on it. He said, Soma is always physical.
Well, if he said that, of course, that's not true to begin with.
Obviously.
That Soma is not always physical. I don't know if I caught it in terms of the argument that he was making on it. But certainly, it's not always physical from that point of view, and that would land him into lots of trouble in dealing with that. And you can start with 1 Corinthians 12.
Very passage I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know if you caught that or not. I know that you didn't respond specifically to it, and so. And then you did develop 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14, the natural man cannot receive the things of God, and trying to tie that in. And he didn't touch that, as I remember.
Yeah. Because when I was going over that, I think I also tied it in with Galatians chapter 3.
Yes.
That
in the flesh.
Yeah. And his concepts on flesh and spirit are kind of weird too.
Yeah.
But that was the distinction between the natural man. The natural man could not receive the things of the Spirit of God, and neither could he know them. And what separated or distinguished them from the pneumaticos man was the fact that they had received the Spirit, and that was the basic distinction between those two. And I pointed out that those were the people. That was a contrast between people who were under the law and the people who had been released from the bondage of the law, having received the Spirit, according to Galatians chapter 3, verses 3 through 5. And then, of course, you have the text in Jude as well. But yeah, that was another interesting point. I don't think it even registered with him on 1 Corinthians 15:49. He did try to comment on it, but I really don't think he caught the import of that because according to that text, and as you know, I've brought this point up several times in 1 Corinthians 15:49, where you have the I think it's an aorist there, or it's a perfect. I keep forgetting on the first part. As we bore the image of the earthy, we shall bear. And
I think it's an active. I think it's an aorist active, if I'm not mistaken.
But I know that the text that is translated as future, we shall bear, comes from defective manuscripts, and that's pretty much acknowledged by scholars. And I think I said it was R.T. France, but I think that's Gordon Fee in the New International Commentary. So that was just kind of a misquote in terms of who the author was, but it's Gordon Fee, and he develops that quite a bit, and it's so obvious that he sees the impact of what that's saying in 1 Corinthians 15 that he has to find something that will sort of comfort his mind in what to apply to it. So he calls it something like behavioral conduct or something in saying, because what that means is if it's aorist subjunctive, it means, one, that it's an action that has the probability of being fulfilled in the future. And according to A.T. Robertson, he says that the aorist subjunctive is always future because it describes potential action. And it's used right alongside the future. And I love looking at that in Romans chapter 6, because in Romans 6, when he talks about we should walk in the newness of life, and then in the next verse, he'll say we shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. So you got both the future and the aorist subjunctive used right there to talk about the same thing, which is the resulting life that comes, at the resurrection. And because that was projected as future at that time, that was looking all the way to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So and the other powerful point about the aorist subjunctive there is that it means that the participants themselves are, the believers are actually participating in their own resurrection from the dead. Now, how does a dead man do that? That is a dead corpse. How does that happen?
That the aorist subjunctive there in when I saw that years and years and years ago, and I don't remember if you're the one that pointed it out to me or not, but when I first
maybe
it could very possibly, but when I saw that, it just became an incredibly powerful point. And when you look at the commentaries, Vines in his expository dictionary of the New Testament words, while the textual evidence favors the subjunctive, it cannot be true, because that would mean that we bear a responsibility for bearing the image of the heavenly. Well, yeah, but like you said, if this is talking about dead bodies, then how does a dead body have any role to play in the bearing the image of Christ? Only living people can determine that by becoming, let me see, as Paul would say in Romans 12, Ephesians 4, Colossians 3, and as Philippians 3. I couldn't help but think of this particular passage as he was talking, William, about the already but not the yet. Paul said that it was his desire to be found being made conformable to the death of Christ, that he might attain unto the resurrection of Christ. And he says, not that I have already attained. Now, just think about that, folks. Scott Clem would say, well, the resurrection of Christ that Paul's talking about there is obviously the physical resurrection. And Paul says, well, I haven't yet attained to that. Well, duh. you haven't died yet. So naturally you have it. But then he goes right ahead in verse 18 and 19 and says, not that I have attained, but to the degree that I have attained. So if the resurrection of Christ that is under consideration there, and that resurrection of Christ is out of the world of the flesh, the old covenant world. It's a covenantal world that he was raised up out of, 1 Peter chapter 3. Then that's what Paul's talking about, because that's the entire context of Philippians chapter 3. Those things that I once counted gain, I now count but loss, that I might attain unto the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and I do count them but dung, that I might be found. And you've pointed this out many times. It's a beautiful thought. That word found, heurisco, is an eschatological term. It points to the resurrection. It points to the parousia. So Paul is saying, at the consummation, my goal is to be found in Christ, being made conformable to his death. Well, once again, we have to ask the question, in what way was Paul looking to be made conformable to Jesus's death? Was he saying, I want to die just like he did? Was he saying, I want to be crucified just like him? So what's the point? What is the nature of being made conformable to the death of Christ that Paul had in mind?
Mm-hmm. And look at that text. He's saying that he wanted to be found not having his own righteousness,
right,
but the righteousness which is through Christ. Speaking about that word found, you go back to Daniel chapter 2, with the image of the metallic image there and dealing with the prophecy of the kingdom. And it will say, when the stone out of the mountain strikes it, it says, and there was no place found for them. So that's in an eschatological setting. And then you have 2 Peter 3, that we might be found in him. And then Revelation 20:11, where it says heaven and earth passed away and no place was found. So all of those are,
the book of Jude.
Yeah, you have Jude, and then you have 2 Corinthians as well, that we should not be found naked. And so that's an eschatological term that I think really should help people to see that. But also in the Philippians 3 text, when he says, if by any means I might attain to the resurrection, it's the word ex anastasin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the resurrection out from among the dead ones, indicating that Paul is experiencing this resurrection that he has not yet attained, contrary to, as you just developed, which God's saying, well, they already had theirs completely on Pentecost. That's past. And yet here is Paul saying concerning the out resurrection from the dead. I sometimes I like to call it the resurrection above ground. And and yet he says he had not yet attained to the fullness of that. That's another example of that already but not yet, which picks up from chapter 1 when he says, he who has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Christ, or perfected until the day of Christ. So it's showing that there was this already but not yet, this consummating of something that was already underway in that passage. So that's a very important concept to understand on resurrection.
And to stay there on Philippians chapter 3, Paul uses a term, not that I have already attained. That word attained is from the Greek word katao. This is a very, very important term. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, Paul said the ends of the ages, the telos of the ages, plural, has come upon us. And that's when he says has come upon us, it's katentao. Mm-hmm. They were living at the time of the arrival of the goal of the previous ages. In Acts chapter 26, Paul speaking of the 12 tribes, and he spoke of the resurrection, and he said, concerning which hope our 12 tribes hope to attain, katentao. And so katentao is not merely, okay, well, I'm going to travel from here to Gainesville, Texas. There is a goal, and in this case, it's the eschatological goal. So Paul in Philippians chapter 3, when he says, I have not yet attained unto this eschatological goal, but he says, I have attained it partly. And that goes back, again, as you were saying, this already but not yet. Pardon me. How could Paul say that he had not yet attained if he says, I've already partly attained? Mm-hmm. So what Scott Clem was wanting to do is to say, here is a resurrection that was past. It's over. It's done with. It's accomplished. But not from Paul's perspective. Paul said it was in the process. They were being made perfect. They were being present active, conformed to the image of God's dear Son. Well, if the resurrection, the spiritual resurrection, was already past, then they had already been transformed into the image of Christ. But according to Paul, being transformed into the image of Christ was through the resurrection of the dead.
Right. And that's 2 Corinthians chapter 3 as
Exactly.
well. You know, we're being transformed. Another point regarding the I had something in my mind right before oh yes, on the idea of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. He was arguing from from Acts chapter 3 that we're dealing with physical resurrection. However, in that because in chapter 4 and verse 2, it talks about them being grieved that they preached through Jesus the resurrection. And that was another question I had asked him about. But in Galatians, not Galatians yet, in Genesis 12 and verse 3, when he says, all families of the earth shall be blessed, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Well, that's the text that Peter is quoting from in Acts chapter 3.
Yeah.
But he applies it as the apostle to the circumcision. He's applying it to Israel in the flesh, and basically telling them that God had sent Jesus to bless them in turning every one of you away from your iniquities. So that's spiritual resurrection. That is the fulfillment of the promise of Abraham. And immediately following that, they become grieved that they're preaching through Jesus the resurrection out of the dead ones. Again, that concept. Paul uses the same text in Genesis and quotes it for the Gentiles. And he says, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the nations through faith, preached before the gospel, saying, in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. So what is justification? Justification is freedom from the guilt and the penalty of sin. But that's what Peter applied and then said it was happening in those days to resurrection. So that's telling you from both ends of the spectrum that it's all about justification and not about bodies coming up out of the ground. And that's what he was telling them in that particular text. Let's see, there was something else as well that I wanted to point out. But anyway, if you had a thought on that, you could.
Well, not on that, but I wanted to get to a question that he asked you. He said, and of course, he intended for this to be an emotionally charged type of a question. When was the atonement perfected?
That's where I wanted to go.
Okay,
but anyway, go ahead.
He quoted Romans chapter 11, speaking of Christ, through whom we have, aorist tense, received, I believe it's perfect tense. If I'm not
2 Corinthians 5 and Romans chapter 5, right?
Romans 5:11, yes.
Yeah.
And one thing that you did that is absolutely great, and it's a definitive answer, which he 100% ignored. You went to Leviticus chapter 9, pointing out that on the Day of Atonement, pardon me, the high priest had to slay the sacrifice, go in and come back out. Until he came back out, there was no atonement.
Right.
And he ignored it. Absolutely ignored it, and just simply kept appealing to Romans chapter 5:11. And again, what are the Hebrews chapter 10. Seeing that we have been purified by faith, let us approach and come boldly before the throne of grace and enter into the most holy place. So if you want to throw any more out there, I think it would be good to help people understand the already but the not yet of the atonement.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, and this will be a bit technical, but for those who are students out there and studying, you'll definitely want to look at this. The reason these guys are saying that it's all done is because in the language, it sounds like that, because he says, in whom we have received the atonement. And so we'll consider that like past tense or past perfect tense and say it's all done in the past. One of the reasons people are doing that is because in those verses, almost all of them, it's the aorist used in the Greek.
Yes.
The aorist is it's like an indefinite tense, so to speak. It has nothing to do with time outside of the present active indicative. So outside of that, it's like the action, it's stated as past action, but it could mean the beginning of that action, the middle of that action, or the actual consummation of that action. So when you read a text like we have been raised up together and made to sit together in the heavenlies in Christ, he's taking in that entire eschaton, not just what happened in the past. That's why when you read Ephesians 1, it'll say we are having our redemption. And then Ephesians 1, 13 and 14, it will talk about the earnest of the inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession. So that's one thing. And those are the verbs that are being used in 2 Corinthians 5, 18 and Romans 5, 10 and 11. But even when you look in the text in 2 Corinthians 5, it will even say, be reconciled to God. And he's saying, do that through the gospel, which was still being revealed and being presented. Secondly, as you were pointing out, the work of the high priest in going into the most holy place and then coming out was the consummation of that process. And Hebrews 9, of course, which is parallel to Leviticus chapter 9. And I suggest that, people study both of those together. And in doing so, he starts off telling you the work of the priest in the temple. One, the priest went in the first part of the tabernacle, but into the second part with the high priest alone once a year to make, atonement for the sins of the people. And that's the part where he goes into the most holy place, enters, with his own blood, etc., which is the latter part of those verses. And even in the text that people quote, but this goes right back to the death of Christ when they're talking about, Jesus's body. We got a physical resurrection here, but they do not take into consideration what the Bible says about Jesus dying. It says he died for our sins. Isaiah 53, several passages there, Matthew 26, 28, 1 Peter 3:18, Romans 4:25, etc. All of these passages says Christ died for our sins. And so that's what's taking place. Hebrews 9 and verse 26 says that he died to put away sin. So that's the beginning of that process. And in verse 28 deals with the consummation of that. But where we have these chapter divisions, it's kind of unfortunate.
Yep.
Because immediately after he says that, he says this, for the law having a shadow of the good things about to come and not the very image of those things. So Hebrews 10:1 is a commentary back on verse 28 and what was taking place in that atonement, showing that it was the law still foreshadowing that, just like in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, when it talks about the feast days and meats and all those things, which were shadows and types, but the body is of Christ. And even there it says that which was about to come. So you've got these imminent statements there. They're still future, and they are still prefiguring that. One of the things that Scott really wanted to do, he wanted to really try to push like Romans 3, 21 through 23, that deals with the Passover. He really wanted to push that into a consummated process, but you just can't do it and make that the atonement and argue that that was the completed process. It's not. It's that fullness that had to come about, and that no one, as you pointed out earlier in the discussion tonight, no one could enter into the most holy until that first tabernacle was removed. So that had to, as long as it had a standing, there was no way that anyone else could enter into the most holy place.
And one of the things that I like to ask, it was not asked and it was not pointed out in the debate, was if you're going to say that the atonement was finished at the cross, then did Jesus have to enter into the most holy place? Well, we know that he entered into the most holy place, according to John chapter 14, to prepare it, prepare it for those who would follow after. So, but if you're going to say that the atonement was consummated, then the most holy place was already prepared. And it's saying, okay, salvation was already a reality. Well, then why did he have to come back to bring salvation? And so they so badly short circuit the atonement process, the atonement typology. And I'll throw this in as a closing comment here because we're out of time. I've got this good friend in Israel that I have mentioned several different times. Two of his sons are leading rabbis in Israel. He is a world-class Hebrew scholar, tremendous, tremendous scholar. And he knows most of the leading rabbis in Jerusalem and what have you. And I've asked him through emails before, in ancient thought, was the Day of Atonement a process initiated by the sacrifice, entrance, and consummated by the return of the high priest out? Or was the atonement, in any sense whatsoever, completed while the high priest was still in the most holy place? He wrote back and he said, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. He said, that suggestion, because I told him a lot of Christians believe that the atonement process was totally consummated on the cross. He said that, of course, he doesn't accept the cross, but nonetheless, the point being that he said to short circuit the atonement process by the simple sacrifice is to completely destroy the process itself. So that's a perspective of a world-class Hebrew scholar whose sons are rabbis. He knows the leading rabbis, and he says it's a totally ridiculous idea. So there we have that. Okay, yeah. William, we didn't get all the way through by any chance, and there's a lot of stuff we wanted. We really need to touch on Scott's argument on 1 John chapter 3, back to Hebrews chapter 12.
Hosea 6.
Pardon?
Hosea 6.
Oh, Hosea 6.
13, yeah.
So, hey.
The first fruits.
Yeah, the first fruits, yeah. We'll pick this up next week if that's good with you.
That's good.
All right, man. Good night. Appreciate it. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.